Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to go through the phases of U.S. foreign policy. And if you look at your handout, you will notice that there are three things that we're going to say about each of the 8 phases of foreign policy that I'm going to talk about today. We're going to talk about ideological underpinnings, important documents, and important events. Now, I suspect that you will have no trouble with the important documents and important events. Those are just simply lists. The most difficult part, and the part most likely to show up on the AP exam, is the ideological underpinnings. Basically, that's where we talk about what people were thinking at the time. Tremendously important, because this is what gives us our connection between foreign policy and other events, foreign policy and the personalities of the time, foreign policy and the other ideas that were going through people's minds. So that really is the meat of the process. So please, when you're writing that down, you might want to extend just a little bit rather than simply, again, writing down the list of items to the extent that you've got space, obviously. But please make sure that when you write these things down, it's going to be something that you're going to understand when you're reviewing these notes prior to the test. So let's go ahead and get started. Our objective today is to understand the sweep of U.S. foreign policy and to trace important developments from 1783, basically the beginnings of the United States, just after we signed the Treaty of Paris of 1783, when the nation got recognized as existing by Great Britain at the end of the Revolution, and you're coming down to the present. Our first phase is confusion, and these are my terms for the most part. If there's a term that is a common term that historians might use, I'll point that out to you as we go through, but for the most part, the titles that I put on these are my titles that I am putting there so that you will have some idea of what's going on. And as you can see, it goes from 1783 to 1823. The ideological underpinnings. We basically at this point have a disagreement between the pro-French Jeffersonians and the pro-British Hamiltonians. Now, the pro-British Hamiltonians, they're really the Federalist Party. Certainly, Jefferson had this ideological leaning toward the French. The French had helped us win the American Revolution. The French were also, after 1789, going to be going through a revolution of their own that, at least in its early phases, looked very much like our revolution. And so Jefferson tended to lean toward that side. Hamilton, on the other hand, tended to think that trade was a much more important factor, and our trading partner was naturally the British. Indeed, our whole economy had developed when we were a British colony, and so our whole economic system was based on being a part of Great Britain, and Hamilton believed, with good reason, that it would make sense for us to continue to trade with Great Britain to the extent that that was going to be possible given the new relationship. There's also a fear of getting drawn into a war that we were not capable of winning. Quite frankly, throughout this period of time, there were numerous threats to go to war with both the English and the French at different times. But fortunately for all of us, our leaders at the time understood that we were a new nation, we were a weak nation, and in taking on one of the two great superpowers of the time, there was very little chance that we would ever succeed. And so the idea was to avoid going to war with especially these two nations, but by and large, any nation. Really, the only military action that we participate in during this time is the War of 1812, which was very nearly disastrous, and the search for the Barbary pirates in 1803 under Jefferson, and they really are not even really a nation. They're really more if you will, a kind of terrorist organization. But at any rate, so let's look at the documents. Certainly the first one, Jay's Treaty, it was a commercial treaty with Great Britain, extremely controversial at the time. There were many people who believed that John Jay, in negotiating the treaty, had given in to the British and was giving them an unfair advantage. The French Orders in Council, these are from the Napoleonic era. Napoleon was attempting to force us to abandon any trade with Great Britain and to embrace trade with France. He had decided to try to force that by not allowing us to trade with France if we traded with Great Britain. Very nearly again erupted into war against the French. Instead, Jefferson put on the Embargo Act, which basically said that we weren't going to trade with anybody. It was disastrous. And it really created, in a sense, our first real economic depression. Certainly for those shipping interests, primarily in New England, it was a disastrous situation. Now, there is an upside to it because it did give some room for some of our infant manufacturing processes to get established, because we weren't trading with other countries that could sell manufactured goods to us more cheaply than we could produce them for ourselves. And earlier I mentioned the War of 1812. Sometimes your textbook sometimes refers to it as the Second War for American Independence. It actually ends in 1815. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in that city in Europe, established the concept of turning, in a sense, the clock back. Status quo ante bellum, which simply means the way it was before the war. Now, with any of these documents, and indeed with any of the events that we're doing, if it looks unfamiliar to you and I have not given you enough of an explanation, you might want to put a little question mark next to it, or highlight it, or something like that, and look it up later. All of these, the information for all of these is readily available. So, what are our important events? The first one is an affair concerning the French ambassador to America. His name was Edmond Genet. He used the honorific citizen, which was what the French revolutionary government replaced the more traditional Madame and Monsieur with. They saw those titles as emblematic of the royalist period, and they wanted to emphasize equality, and everybody simply got the title citizen, no matter what your gender, no matter what your social class had been. Nonetheless, Genet comes to the United States. He tried to recruit an army of Americans to go to France to support the French Revolution. Washington opposed this. Genet tried to go over Washington's head, and Washington demanded his recall. The second important event is something called the XYZ affair. Again, almost caused a war with France. We were trying to negotiate a treaty with the French. The French foreign minister was Talleyrand, and Talleyrand demanded a bribe. And that bribe was to be paid by people in the coded communication. They were simply noted as X, Y, and Z, hence the name of the affair. We also have the Napoleonic Wars that broke out between primarily Great Britain and France, at least in terms of the way they affected the United States. They're much bigger than that from a European context, but from our perspective, it's an England versus France thing. And those wars began really about, I want to say 1806, continued down to Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815. We did get one good thing out of that. We got the purchase of Louisiana. In 1803, France controlled the area west of the Mississippi River and the city of New Orleans. Since the city of New Orleans was at the bottom of the Mississippi River, and we determined that the Mississippi River was going to be very important to any westward development of the United States, we were very concerned that we might be in a situation where, in a sense, France could hold us hostage. Jefferson wanted to purchase the city of New Orleans, and he authorized people, his delegation, to offer $10 million for the city of New Orleans. Napoleon, who needed cash and had rather little use for these lands in North America, his thinking was thoroughly European, counter-offered with the idea of getting the whole territory for $15 million, and that turned out to be the successful purchase, and indeed doubled the size of the country for a bargain price. And then, of course, we have the War of 1812 itself, again, this Second War of American Independence. I don't begin to have the time to go over that, but again, if you take a look in the textbook, you will find it explained to your satisfaction. You could probably even go online and look at, at the various online encyclopedias and gain information about it. Our second phase is isolation, and it is far and away the longest phase. It really goes on for almost 3/4 of a century. It is this period of time when we're largely isolating ourselves from the rest of the world, and that isolation begins with Washington's advice to the nation in his farewell address. And if you know nothing else about foreign policy, know about Washington's farewell address. It is mentioned 3 different times in the literature that the AP people give us. Washington counseled the nation to, quote, refrain from entering into entangling alliances. And that really is the ideological underpinning, not just for this period, but for the period of American history going from basically 1920 until the beginning of World War II. So this is a tremendously, tremendously important document. Now, we're able to do that because we have the Atlantic Ocean to the east of us and the Pacific Ocean to the west of us, and we have this sense that those oceans will keep us safe, that we're really too far away from any European nation for them to force us into a war. They couldn't attack us successfully, at least that's the theory, and therefore if we just kept our noses clean and out of European affairs, we could rely upon the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans to keep us safe. Of course, there is also the factor that to the north of us there is Canada, which was a British possession for most of this period of time. So that did represent something of a threat, but after 1815, that threat was largely dealt with. And, of course, Mexico to the south, which was part of the Spanish Empire, but the Spanish Empire was declining in importance. Mexico would get its independence in, I believe, the 1820s, but they are too weak, really, to present any considerable threat to the United States. So basically, we came to the conclusion that we could afford to be isolated and that that would be our best foreign policy. Of course, we also have the idea that Europe's wars were evidence of a corrupt and dying society. In the sense of, or at least in the ideological sense, we were the harbinger of the new form of government, democracy. Democracy would bring with it peace. Again, at least that was the theory. That these European monarchs were pursuing wars for their own silly reasons, or at least they looked silly to us, and as a way of advancing their power. And we simply believed that our way of life, our way of government, our ideology was replacing the traditional ideology of Europe, and that we really did not need to involve ourselves in their affairs for any sense of ideological reasoning. And the last one is the idea of manifest destiny, the concept that we were destined to rule North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that that was our role, that our future was not in Europe, our future was in the western part of North America. And that's crucial. We don't need to interact with Europe to get what we want. Important documents, not many of them. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 is the second thing that I would really want to emphasize that you take out of this process. Again, if you don't understand the other things, understand Washington's farewell address, understand the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, the Monroe Doctrine is our promise to Europe that if they will refrain from messing around in the affairs of North and South America, the Western Hemisphere, that we would refrain from messing around in the affairs of the Eastern Hemisphere, and that we would not oppose them in anything that they wanted to do as long as they stayed on their half of the world. The second is the Adams-Onis Treaty. That's the treaty that got us Florida. We did trade off some land north of our northern border. There was an irregular border with Canada, not the nice straight line that you see today. And so that established that as our territory. And the last one is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War of 1848 and got for us another chunk of modern-day America, pretty much the whole Southwest. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, part of Colorado, part of Wyoming, part of Utah, and all of those territories entered the United States during this period of time. And indeed, by the end of the period of time, most of them were indeed states. So what are the important events? Well, we see a lot of revolutions going on in Latin America and a gradual weakening of the Spanish Empire. Spanish Empire had been tremendously important as we studied it during the colonial period, especially during the period of exploration. But starting in 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English, Spain goes into a decline. That decline continued as very, very gradual. It would not be finished as an imperial power until 1898. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes in the next phase. But we do have this gradually weakening Spanish Empire. We also have the Mexican-American War that we talked about before. This basically started over Texas. Texas had gotten its independence. They declared independence from Mexico. They wanted to become part of the United States. Under the James Polk administration, Texas became part of the United States. Mexico opposed that, and we ended up at war with them. The conflict over Oregon, the northwestern United States. The Oregon Territory was much larger than simply today's state of Oregon. It started with what is today's state of Oregon, also included today's state of Washington, and then the Canadian provinces immediately north of that. And there was an argument between the British and the United States as to who ruled that, and eventually they were able to come to a compromise where the British got the northern part of it, the Americans got the southern part of it, and the current boundary between Canada and the United States was complete. We also have the opening of Japan. Now that's kind of a contradiction of the isolationist trend. We are not messing around a lot with Europe. When we do mess around, we're messing around with Asia. Japan was extremely weak. They had been isolated for a couple of 100 years. And President Fillmore sent Commodore Perry and 3 ships into Tokyo Harbor and, in a sense, forced the opening of Japan to American trade. And during the U.S. Civil War, which obviously is part of this period, not a major factor at this point, but it does bring some difficulties with the British. There was an attempt by the United States to take Confederate diplomats by force off of a British ship called the Trent, and that resulted in British threats of going to war. They were a vastly larger naval power than we were. Lincoln decided that discretion was the better part of valor, as it were, released the diplomats, and made nice with the British. There was also a ship that was built by or paid for by the Confederate States, built in Great Britain, called the Alabama. It was a large, fast ship, far and away the best ship in the Confederate Navy, which is not saying a lot, but nonetheless, the Alabama was responsible for the sinking of a number of U.S. ships. We blamed the British for that. The British claimed that it had not been built with the official permission of the British government, but nonetheless it had been built in Great Britain. And eventually, after the war, the British paid the United States a large amount of money, I've forgotten now exactly how much, to compensate us for those ships that we lost. And we also see Great Britain developing as an important source of U.S. investment capital, especially with the railroads. There was a great deal of money in Great Britain that was looking for a home. A number of investment capitalists that were looking for profitable places to put their money. The United States represented a market in which that could potentially happen, and a number of British investors did indeed invest in United States railroads, and that was very important to our development as a nation. So that's not official, it's not the British government, it's really British capitalists. Our third phase, a relatively short period of time, as you can see, about 24 years, when we're flirting with the idea of having an empire. We are abandoning for the first time, but not the last, this idea of isolation. The ideological underpinnings of this are a new manifest destiny. By 1890, our population stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. We had largely achieved the goals of the people who were talking about manifest destiny in the 1830s. Now there is this new manifest destiny in which we're going to look further west, and by further west we mean primarily Asia. We also have the closing of the frontier, basically another way of stating the same thing that I just talked about, the fact that our population had gone all the way to the west. It was no longer possible to draw a line that separated the settled areas of the United States from the unsettled areas. The third ideological underpinning is a book called The Impact of Sea Power Upon History, written by Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan. Basically, Mahan is arguing that if the United States is going to become the great power that it deserves to become, we will need to build an empire for strictly utilitarian reasons. Basically, the ships of the time ran on coal. Coal was bulky, and coal needed to be stored someplace. And Mahan's argument was, especially in the Pacific, it would be important for us to establish a series of islands where we could stockpile coal that could be used to fuel our ships in the event that there was difficulty in that part of the world. And so, and actually, we become very interested in a number of islands in the South Pacific, most importantly Hawaii, which also has another importance, but nonetheless, part of the importance of Hawaii is as a coaling station. We also see a poem, this time by a British man named Rudyard Kipling, called The White Man's Burden. The White Man's Burden argued that it was the responsibility of the more advanced white race to come to the rescue of the other races of the world in order to bring to them the benefits of European democracy, of European industrialization, basically of European moral structures, European society. The perception was that that would be a huge advantage to the people of Asia, the people of Africa, the people of the rest of the world. And Kipling's poem, again, he was an Englishman, but his poem had a great impact on many Americans, and was the sort of thing that oftentimes students in junior high school and high school would often be instructed to memorize this. This poem begins, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, and so on and so on and so on. Of considerably more importance was Theodore Roosevelt, his big stick diplomacy, the idea that we needed to rely upon action to further U.S. power around the world. Probably the best example of big stick diplomacy was the Panama Canal and the way that we obtained the rights to build the Panama Canal. Again, don't have the time to go into it now. If you don't remember, it's easy to find out, and I would recommend that you do so. After Theodore Roosevelt stops being president in 1909, he is replaced by William Howard Taft. Taft is a proponent, of dollar diplomacy, of using our financial strength as a way to gain power around the world. And the last of these three levels of diplomacy is Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. Wilson became president in 1913. And his argument is that it is important that the United States achieve a higher moral plane than you would have seen with either big stick diplomacy or dollar diplomacy, that it was necessary to apply the truths of the Bible. Wilson's father was a Presbyterian minister, so he was well trained in this language to, if you recall the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so that idea is going to form the centerpiece of Wilson's moral diplomacy. What are the important documents of this time? The first one is something called the Open Door Note. This comes out of the McKinley administration. His Secretary of State, sorry, I can't think of the guy's first name, John Hay, was responsible for this note in which we proposed that the United States would be the protector of Chinese independence. One of the things that we were able to get in the Spanish-American War of 1898 was Cuba. But before we started the war, we disclaimed any attempt to want to own Cuba. And so that was done officially in something called the Teller Amendment. It was an amendment, if I recall correctly, to the resolution when we declared war upon Spain in 1898. Of course, the war only lasted for about 4 months. It ended with the Treaty of Paris of 1898, which ended the Spanish-American War. And again, I know I mentioned this to you before. Whenever you see the phrase Treaty of Paris, you want to look at the date after it. There are several treaties of Paris. There is a Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War. There is a Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution in 1783. There is the Treaty of Paris of 1898. There's also a Treaty of Paris that ended our involvement in the war in Vietnam in 1973. So you really want to make sure that you have the dates for the treaties, various treaties of Paris. We fulfilled the promise that we had made in the Teller Amendment with the Platt Amendment. In 1904, we granted Cuba a certain limited independence. It was far from the real thing, but it was, in the minds of Americans, a fulfillment of the promise that we had made in the Teller Amendment. The last is the Roosevelt Corollary. This is a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine told Europeans that they were not allowed to intervene in the affairs of Latin America. The Roosevelt Corollary said, but if anybody does need to intervene in the affairs of Latin America, that will be the United States. Important events. We have the Spanish-American War again of 1898. Following the Spanish-American War, one of the things that we get out of the Spanish-American War is ownership of the Philippines. The Filipinos had been in a state of insurrection, you could call it a revolution if you want, against the Spanish for some years. They were no more happy about being ruled by the Americans than they were about being ruled by the Spanish, and so they rose up against us once we had their territory. And there was a very bitter battle that went on from basically 1898 until 1905, when we came to a settlement and entered into a treaty with the Filipinos where the Filipinos would gain eventual independence. That and that did indeed happen in 1946. So the idea was that they would have time to prepare themselves to become a democracy. We have an incursion into Mexico. Very late during this period of time, Pancho Villa invaded the little town of Columbus, New Mexico. It is the only time the United States has been invaded since the War of 1812. We sent out troops to try to catch him. We never did, and we by and large called off our incursion against the Mexicans as World War I loomed on the horizon. The last one is the occupation of Haiti. Haiti then and now is just a nation in search of a disaster. It is far and away the most impoverished nation in the Western Hemisphere. They had had a revolution. It was extremely brutal. Wilson sent in troops to try to keep peace there. Those troops ended up staying in Haiti for 19 years. Now, it was never a big story, but it certainly was a long one. Our fourth phase is World War I, 1914 to 1919. Obviously, the United States is not involved in it all of that time. Our involvement, our direct involvement begins in 1917, but the war itself began in 1914. It ended in 1918 with the Treaty of Versailles being signed in 1919. Ideological underpinnings, again, Wilson's moral diplomacy. In the speech that Wilson made to declare or ask Congress to declare war on Germany, he used two phrases, both of which are important as illustrations of the ideas of moral diplomacy. We're not just getting into this war for our own idle purposes. We are entering this war to end the concept of war itself and to make the world safe for democracy. Important documents. No sooner are we in the war than Wilson comes up with his peace proposal. He called that the 14 points. Wilson's war message, from which I quoted earlier. The Zimmerman Note is a very important document in terms of leading us into the war. The German foreign minister was a man by the name of Zimmerman. According to the note, and there was some doubt as to whether it was authentic or whether it had been faked by the British. We'll never know for sure. But according to this coded telegram, presumably sent by Zimmerman to the Mexicans, that if Mexico would help Germany prevail, should the United States become involved in the war, then Germany would see that Mexico would get back some of the territory it had lost in 1848 to the United States as part of the settlement of the Mexican-American War. That really presents a direct threat to certainly the southwestern United States, and for a long time Wilson had been able to avoid going into this war with the idea that there was no direct threat to the United States. The Zimmerman Note created that threat. And then the last one is the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, tried to create something called the League of Nations, which was ultimately unsuccessful. And again, I don't have anywhere near enough time to go into it in any detail, but you might want to look that up if you don't recall what I'm talking about. The important events, Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare, which is in Wilson's speech, is the cause of the United States entering the war. They began sinking our ships, primarily merchant ships. It was not unreasonable. Most of those merchant ships were carrying armaments and supplies to the British, but nonetheless, we objected to the sinking of those ships by these German submarines. Mobilization. Once we go to war, the process of getting a society together to fight that war. And there were a number of actions that were taken by the government, probably the most important ones being the nationalization of the railroads, where the management of the railroads was simply assumed by the federal government. They never took them in the sense that they owned the railroads, but their management was taken over by the government. You may also recall the Sedition Acts, the Espionage Acts, which were also important parts of getting us involved in that war. And again, if you don't recall what they are, look them up. It won't be hard. The next one is the Versailles Peace Conference. That's this conference at the end of World War I. We are heavily involved. Wilson tried to persuade our European allies to adopt his ideas of what should happen at the end of the war. He was ultimately unsuccessful. The only thing that he got that he wanted was the League of Nations, and then the League of Nations turned out not to work out. So the Versailles Peace Conference is sort of a symbol, if you will, for high-flown values that basically end up meaning just about nothing. And of course, when Wilson came back from France, the Versailles Treaty was rejected by the United States Senate. They saw the League of Nations as a threat to American sovereignty, that this international organization could potentially lead the United States into war despite whatever Congress said. Our fifth phase is relatively short. And again, this is my phrase, nostalgic isolation. We're hearkening back to that period from basically the end of the War of 1812 until we began to flirt with the idea of an empire. We're now looking back at that, and I use the word nostalgic deliberately. Really what we're kind of doing is looking back to it as a peaceful time. It never really was all that peaceful, but from the point of view of 1920, the nation coming out of World War I, we began wanting that again. The ideological underpinnings, again, you see Washington's farewell address. I don't think I need to explain that again. There was a real sense by 1920, 1921 that our involvement in World War I had been a mistake. It had basically cost us thousands of lives and hadn't really accomplished anything. Important documents. There are two big documents that come out of this. The Dawes Plan, which was a plan where we loaned money to the Germans so that the Germans would be able to make the reparations payments to Great Britain and France, and then the British and the French could use that money to pay their war debts to the United States. So it was kind of a circular process, but it did enable the Europeans to sort of keep an economy together at least through the end of the 1920s. It gets blown out of the water by the Great Depression, but then pretty much everything else got blown out of the water by the Great Depression anyway. The other important document, and maybe we should put important in quotes here, it looks important, whether it really was or not is another story. Frank Kellogg was the U.S. Secretary of State. The French Foreign Minister was Aristide Briand. They entered into a pact with many other nations to simply make war illegal. The first signatory to the Kellogg-Briand Pact was Gustav Stresemann, who at that point was the Chancellor of Germany. Should give you some idea how well this worked out. What are some important events? We have a naval conference in Washington in 1923 in which the British and we agree to limit the number of ships that we have in our Navy, sort of a sign of a reestablishment of peace. Presumably, if there was peace, those ships would be not needed. The only purpose that they could serve, at least according to the people who went to the naval conference, was to make war more possible, and so this is sort of an anti-war situation. Another conference was held in London in 1930. It was the London Economic Conference. It's being held as a reaction, or at least an attempt, largely unsuccessful, but an attempt to come up with a worldwide way of fighting the Great Depression. And of course, the next event, the Great Depression itself, began with the stock market crash in 1929. And I presume you are aware of the effects on the United States, but it was a worldwide depression. and is often cited as, you know, the event that brought Adolf Hitler to power in Germany and thereby helped cause World War II. The last one are a series of committees held by the United States Senate in the mid-1930s, led by Senator Gerald Nye. And basically they are investigating how we got into World War I. Why they are investigating the events of 1917 in 1935 is questionable, but nonetheless what comes out of it are a series of laws by which the United States will, by law, not make the mistakes in the belief of the Nye Committee that drew us into World War I. Unfortunately, they were totally ineffective in terms of keeping us out of phase number 6, which is World War II. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about World War II. You know a lot about it. Let's go to the ideological underpinnings. Certainly revenge against Japan. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and we wanted revenge against them. The perceived need to defeat this Rome-Tokyo-Berlin axis. It saw the development of a special relationship between Great Britain and the United States, in which we became literally the best of friends, and that special relationship continues right down to today. The important documents are the pact that Hitler and Stalin signed early in the war not to make war on each other. Obviously, Hitler violated that pact, but for about 3 years it did keep the Soviet Union out of the war. The Atlantic Charter, an agreement between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. Actually, even before we got in the war, it was signed on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was quite secret at the time, but basically it spelled out Allied goals in the event that the United States did enter World War II on the side of the British, which of course is what happened. After the war, we see a group of international businessmen, international financiers coming together to try to create a new economic order for the world after World War II, and that comes to be called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And that agreement would remain in effect into the 1970s. I doubt seriously that you'll have a question on it, but you should at least be familiar with the term. And the last one is the United Nations Charter, this creation of this organization that it's been a rocky road, but at least so far has been able to play a role in preventing World War III. The important events we're just not going to go into. We could spend several periods talking about the important events of World War II. If you don't remember them, again, look it up. You've got notes. And we need to proceed on because time is flying. Phase number 7 is the Cold War, this period of time during which we were in a struggle against the Soviet Union. And then the period immediately after the Cold War, when basically we were not just the most powerful nation in the world, but the only really powerful nation in the world. The ideological underpinnings of the Cold War are the threat of communism, and there's also this fear that we could have World War III. Remember, there had only been 20 years between the end of the First World War and the beginning of World War II. The fear was that if there was just another 20-year period of relative peace, that basically long about 1965 we'd have World War III, that World War III would be a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and as used to be said, the only losers will be the survivors, that it would basically destroy life as we know it. After the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of talk about something called the peace dividend. The idea that now that the Soviet Union no longer existed, that we could take the money that had been used previously for military strength and use it for social purposes. One heard a lot about this, especially during the administration of Bill Clinton. And, of course, a great deal of uncertainty in the Middle East. One of the outcomes of World War II was the creation of the nation of Israel. That has in turn created a great deal of friction with Israel's neighbors, the Arabic nations, from which the land that comprises Israel was taken. So there have been a series of wars where largely we have taken the side of the Israelis during this period of time. The important documents. The Iron Curtain speech that Winston Churchill gave in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, in which he described this, in his phrase, Iron Curtain that had descended to separate the communist parts of Eastern Europe from the democratic nations of Western Europe. We also have a document that came to be called the Truman Doctrine, where basically we promised that we would assist any nation fighting against communism. NSC 68 was and it's just simply a National Security Council document. It created the concept of containment, that process by which we would acknowledge that the Soviet Union had taken most of the areas of Eastern Europe and there wasn't much we could do about it, but we could prevent them from spreading any further. And then the last one is the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, in which we attempted to get together with the Soviet Union and at least limit the number of weapons that we were building. And it was to some degree successful. What are the important events? Well, Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. Our attempt to keep it from spreading further by using the one tool that the United States had in abundance that the Soviet Union had almost none of, and that is good old cold hard cash. And so we spent huge amounts of money to help rebuild the countries of Western Europe to prevent them from falling to the communists. The Berlin airlift, in which the Soviet Union tried to take over the British, American, and French sectors of the city of Berlin. There, East Germany surrounded Berlin. They attempted to starve it out. We used our aircraft to successfully keep West Berlin from Soviet domination. The establishment of two treaty organizations, one quite successful, the other one not so much. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, continues to exist. It's basically the United States and our European allies. The other one was called SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, not nearly as successful. But it does provide a sort of ideological underpinning for our going into Vietnam in the 1960s. The Chinese Revolution that brought Mao Zedong into power. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953, this first place where, as they said at the time, the Cold War got hot. Now, interestingly enough, it never was the United States shooting directly at the Soviet Union. It was us helping the South Koreans to shoot at the North Koreans, who were in turn being helped by the Soviet Union, but it allowed us to maintain the facade that we were not at war with the Soviet Union. We are going to see that happen again in Vietnam. The building of the Berlin Wall in 1961 to separate East Berlin from this little free island that was stuck in the middle of East Germany. The Vietnam War, again, don't have a lot of time to talk about it. Something you might want to spend some time looking up. Something that we did talk about in a pretty fair amount of detail relatively few days ago was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so, again, take a look at your notes for that event. And then the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded the neighboring nation of Kuwait, and we put together an international coalition that came to the defense of Kuwait and forced Saddam Hussein back out. Our last phase begins with the bombing of the World Trade Center on September the 11th, 2001, and goes down to the present. Ideological underpinnings are the war against terror, a phrase invented by President Bush that has come to describe this really rather odd situation where we are at war, but we are not at war against a nation. We are at war against a group of terrorists who operate in many different nations, and that's been a very difficult part of this process. It's a lot easier to fight against a nation. Nations can't move around. Terrorists can. There is also the contrary sense that we came out of Vietnam very uncertain about our own role in the world. We're clearly the most powerful nation in the world, but there's deep uncertainty about how we should use that power. And so there is a lot of uncertainty, and it continues even down to today, when you could see elements of things that look very much like the anti-war movement in Vietnam in reaction to the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan that President Bush got us into in the very early 2000s. Important documents, well, can't really tell you at this point. It's just too new. Important events, well, the first one is obvious, the bombing of the World Trade Center, and then the subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And now, under President George W. Bush, George Bush the Younger, we took a pretty, I guess, bellicose, warlike attitude toward these nations. That would change with the coming of President Obama, and he attempted to recast foreign policy in a more cooperative mode. Again, did not enjoy a great deal of success with that. What President Trump will do with that is a matter of conjecture. He certainly has made he's been a bit more saber-rattling. Whether that will actually translate into real action remains to be seen. But there are certainly some signs that President Trump will operate much more like President Bush than he will like President Obama. But as I said, that remains to be seen. And so that is the end of our lesson today. Again, do some studying for the AP exam. Get those notes out, look over them. Don't try to memorize big lists of events, but do spend some time making yourself comfortable with the material that we have spent the last year covering. And we will see you when we see you.